On this Friday night, macabre discovery.
The world has to acknowledge this is a genocide of the Ukrainian people.
The hundreds of unmarked graves found in a city reclaimed from Russian forces. Heartfelt messages for Her Majesty.
I'm quite good at expressing my feelings through writing.
And the ever-extending line to see her one last time. Asylum seekers say they're being duped and dumped. The intensifying border battle with migrants caught in the middle. And hitting a royal high note. Some of the musicians behind performances fit for kings and queens.
Global National with Farah Nasser, reporting tonight from London.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We're here in London, overlooking Westminster Abbey, where the Queen's funeral will take place on Monday. We have extensive royal coverage in just a moment, but we want to begin tonight with the situation in Ukraine. An investigation is underway into a disturbing discovery. Ukrainian authorities have found hundreds of graves in an area recently retaken from Russia. The mass burial site is in a forest just outside of Izium, a city about 120 kilometers southeast of Kharkiv. Izium was invaded in the early days of the war and used by Russia as a key military hub. Now, Ukraine believes the site could be the largest mass grave uncovered in the war so far. Eric Sorensen has more on the discovery and what it could mean for the conflict. And a warning, this story does contain some disturbing images.
It is a sickening discovery, every bit as gruesome as feared. Well over 400 bodies have now been discovered in graves in the woods of Izium, a region hastily abandoned by Russian forces just days ago. This man recalls finding a family of 7 killed in their home and now likely buried here. Investigators are looking for clues as to how each person died, some with hands tied behind their backs, some are children. The aim is to get the facts, says this Ukrainian war crimes prosecutor. The world has to acknowledge that this is a genocide of the Ukrainian people. On the day the United Nations marks as the International Day of Peace, the UN says it's sending investigators to Izium to examine the bodies that have been found. Our investigators will work with international ones, says Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. In Izium, he says 450 bodies were found buried, some tortured. The discovery comes just as Russia's Vladimir Putin is being confronted publicly at a summit of loosely allied nations in Uzbekistan. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Putin, "Today's era is not a war era. I have told you on the phone about this." Putin acknowledged, quote, "the concerns you constantly expressed," and said he wants to stop the conflict as soon as possible, but says Ukraine has rejected talks. A day earlier, Putin met with China's President Xi Jinping and said the Chinese leader expressed his concerns. Right now, Putin appears to have few friends and fewer options.
Putin doesn't have any good options. His best option is to push for negotiations. It buys him time. It allows Russian forces to regroup.
Back in Izium, the grisly task of finding bodies carries on. We have found video of the burial here, says Oleg Kotenko, a missing persons officer. A sign says there are 17 bodies. We will count them, he says. There is still much to uncover. The Russians are gone, but Ukraine's president says they left behind death everywhere. Eric Sorensen, Global News.
Moscow's global isolation continues to be felt, and the latest blow is coming from Buckingham Palace, who omitted Vladimir Putin from the invite list to Queen Elizabeth's state funeral. But a key Ukrainian figure has reportedly been invited, and that is First Lady Olena Zelenska. She's said to be joining dozens of other world leaders here in London on Monday to represent Ukraine. According to Britain's The Sun newspaper, Zelenska will attend a reception hosted by King Charles the day before the funeral and then fly back to Ukraine as soon as the ceremony ends. The vigil capped off a day of heavy emotions in the British capital as the nation prepares for a state funeral unlike any other seen before. Our Europe Bureau Chief Crystal Goomansingh joins us now. And Crystal, you're near Westminster Hall right now where people exit after paying respects to the Queen.
Yeah, Farah, people are filing past right now. They've had the opportunity to file past the Queen's coffin as it lies in state. Now, these people have waited about 11 hours on average. The people in line right now, still waiting to make their way into Westminster Hall, are being told it will be a very long and cold night in the queue. We should mention the accessible queue has been shut down. All the spaces have been allotted, and it won't reopen until midday Saturday. But of course, this isn't the only queue. Thousands were also waiting in line to file past and lay flowers at the floral tribute in nearby Green Park. They're calm and carrying on, but with heavy hearts. The emotional load, palatial.
I say farewell at 96. My mind, my soul, I feel them slip. But I do not worry, I do not fear. My family, my children are surrounding me here. As I drift from one reality to another, I begin to soon discover my beloved Philip, so strong and proud. I'm not really good at expressing my feelings, but I'm quite good at expressing my feelings through writing, and I wrote it because I was really upset when the Queen died.
Many are putting pen to paper, sharing both their grief and memories of Queen Elizabeth II. Rows and rows of tributes are being placed with great care and diligently observed. Many, still hoping to pay their respects Friday afternoon, were jolted.
It's been closed until further notice.
The queue reached capacity. People were told to leave and watch for updates, but no one moved.
No idea what this is all about.
Now, we've come a long way today, all of us, haven't we? So, all different parts of the country, so we need to pay our respects to the Queen.
The shutdown only lasted a few hours, but mourners were told they might not reach Westminster for 24 hours. The BBC reports it will likely be the largest single ceremonial event staged in Britain since the Second World War.
Just walking through this really put into perspective how the globe has been impacted by this.
I'm calm at peace, no need to be sad. The freedom of this makes me glad. I no longer hurt or feel this pain, so goodbye Britain until we meet again.
12-year-old Ava telling me that she feels like she's lost her grandmother. Meanwhile, the royal grandchildren will be holding a vigil at the corners of their grandmother's coffin tomorrow, just as their parents did today. Now, the 8 grandchildren, it's not known if they'll take 2 different shifts. Their parents were there for about 15 minutes. And we can also say, Farah, that the Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, will be in his royal dress, his military dress tomorrow as the royal grandchildren hold vigil in front of the coffin.
Crystal Goomansingh on the streets of London for us tonight. Thank you, Crystal. Before tonight's vigil at Westminster Hall, King Charles was in Wales for his first visit as the new monarch. A ceremonial 21-gun salute welcomed the King and wife Camilla, the Queen Consort, to Cardiff. The royal couple greeted crowds before the King addressed members of the Welsh Parliament, saying it had been a privilege to serve as Prince of Wales for more than 60 years. The trip marked the last of the King's visits to the UK's 4 nations as the new monarch. The new Prince and Princess of Wales, meanwhile, were at an army training centre just outside of London to meet with Commonwealth troops who travelled to the UK for the Queen's state funeral. Among them are nearly 100 Canadian Armed Forces personnel who are said to be taking part in Monday's ceremony, along with a contingent from the RCMP. And a high-profile group of Canadians landed in London today ahead of the Queen's funeral on Monday. Among them, dignitaries, a celebrity, and an Olympian. Our Abigail Beeman is traveling with the contingent and joins us now with how the next few days are expected to unfold. Abigail.
Farah, about 2,000 people are expected to be inside Westminster Abbey for the funeral. The Canadian delegation numbers 19, about half of them traveling together to London. Joining Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on this trip, his wife Sophie, the Governor General Mary Simon and her husband, as well as 4 former Prime Ministers and 2 former Governors General. Other Canadians making up the 19 members of the group are 3 Indigenous leaders, including Assembly of First Nations National Chief Roseanne Archibald, as well as actress Sandra Oh and Olympian Mark Tewksbury. Ahead of the Queen's funeral Monday, we're expecting the Prime Minister to have his first audience with now King Charles III, as well as a bilateral meeting with the new UK Prime Minister Liz Truss. It was the Queen's wish to have a representation of Canadians present. The same is true for other Commonwealth nations and their delegations. Farah?
Abigail Beeman in Ottawa at Ottawa International Airport. Thank you, Abigail. To stay together or break up. Coming up, how Canadians are feeling about preserving ties with the British monarchy. Plus, why the White House says Republicans are using migrants as political pawns. In the U.S., humanitarian groups have condemned what they've called political stunts, part of a Republican campaign to reignite the debate over illegal border crossings. This week, dozens of migrants boarded planes and buses to wealthy Democratic strongholds. Many migrants say they were duped and dumped. As Jackson Proskow reports, their relocations were organized by Texas and Florida's Republican governors, who claimed they were just trying to make a point about a so-called immigration crisis on their doorstep along America's southern border.
Far from the southern border, the resort island of Martha's Vineyard is now at the center of the U.S. immigration crisis. 50 Venezuelan asylum seekers, including young children, were sent here without warning. They told me there was a work opportunity, he says. We were going to a city, but we ended up staying here. None speak English or have family nearby. They say they were tricked into boarding planes in Texas, jets chartered by Florida's Republican governor, Ron DeSantis.
They were promised jobs and they were promised immigration papers.
The Republican governor of Texas has used the same tactics. This week, busing more than 100 migrants to the Washington home of the vice president without food or proper clothing.
What they're doing is simply wrong. It's un-American. It's reckless.
So far this year, more than 13,000 asylum seekers have been sent from southern states to Washington, Chicago, and New York. Shelters are nearing the breaking point.
We are not a sanctuary state, and it's better to be able to go to a sanctuary jurisdiction. And yes, we will help facilitate that transport for you.
Opponents accuse the governors of using vulnerable refugees as political pawns. There are calls for the Justice Department to investigate possible violations of federal law.
We are also oppressed in our countries, and we don't come here to be oppressed again, to be trafficked again.
With no end in sight to the humanitarian crisis and with midterm elections looming, the governors say they won't stop shipping asylum seekers across the country until there are reforms at the border. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Germany says it's prepared for retaliation from Russia after it placed a Russian-owned refinery under federal control. Germany says the decision was made to protect the country and to ensure energy supplies continue, given Russia has threatened to turn off the taps to Europe. EU sanctions placed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine have created an energy crisis. The refinery supplies Berlin with 90% of its fuel. Germany is in talks to get supplies from other countries like Poland and Kazakhstan if Russia decides to stop exports. At least 9 people are dead after torrential overnight rains and flash flooding hit central Italy. Around 40 centimeters of rain fell within 2 to 3 hours, which is a third of the usual amount seen all year. Hundreds of firefighters are currently helping in the area and have rescued dozens of people who climbed onto roofs and up trees to escape the water. And in central China, a fire tore through a 42-story skyscraper, sending flaming debris raining down on the streets. It broke out inside the office tower housing the country's biggest telecom operator, where 35 tons of fuel for servers were stored. Dozens of floors burned in just 20 minutes, and people working inside were seen escaping the flames. No deaths have been reported. Firefighters put the fire out within about half an hour. Ahead, could Canada cut off the king? The debates about royal ties and whether the Queen's death could cause the Commonwealth to crack and spur a republic.
You're watching Global National.
The Canadian flag, as we know it, is iconic, but choosing a distinct design devoid of the British Union Jack led to heated debate in the 60s. A similar debate is happening now regarding King Charles III's role as Canada's head of state. New polling from Ipsos found that 54% of Canadians agree it's time to end formal ties with the monarchy. However, a deeper dive into the numbers sees only 20% strongly agree, far short of the unanimity needed to make it happen. Mike Drolet has more on an argument that has Canadians feeling conflicted.
Queen Elizabeth's deep connection to Canada was on display every time she rode her favorite horse. Burma had been gifted to her by the RCMP in 1969. Within Canada, her image was everywhere, from Canadian currency to the portraits hung in arenas. Well, new polling from Ipsos confirms the depths of her relationship with Canada. 82% of Canadians were happy with how she conducted herself as monarch, although her heir, King Charles III, clearly has his work cut out for him in the eyes of Canadians.
It proves that what we've known for a long time, that it was the Queen who was holding the monarchy together.
When it comes to favorability numbers, King Charles and Queen Consort Camilla are low, and their lack of popularity has, in part, reopened the discussion about the King's role as Canada's head of state, even if the survey does show Canadians don't strongly agree one way or the other.
The only thing that's been keeping us a monarchy, aside from obviously the popularity of the Queen, is apathy. And as long as people don't care and aren't interested, then we'll continue to be a monarchy.
Well, people care, but the question is, how much? When weighing the pros and cons, Canadians see the monarchy as something that helps define our identity, while helping to keep us distinct from the U.S. But flip the coin, and Canadians see the royals as nothing more than celebrities with uncomfortable ties to colonialism.
You have to say to yourself, okay, if we're going to do away with the monarchy, what are we going to replace it with?
And while Canadians are clearly conflicted, former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario David Onley says the constitutional requirement to have the House of Commons, Senate, and all 10 provinces unanimously consent to sever ties makes it a long shot.
When you think of the problems facing Canada that we have today, where does the priority fit for, ending our relationship with the monarchy? Is it in the top 10, the top 20? I think that's a companion survey I'd like to see. Where does it fit?
It might not be a pressing issue, but it's one that won't go away. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
And the funeral for the Queen is on Monday at Westminster Abbey, just behind me. And we're going to have live coverage starting at 5 a.m. Eastern, 2 a.m. Pacific here on Global Television, globalnews.com, and on our other streaming platforms. Next, music fit for a king. Meet the dedicated musicians who play for the royal family. The Queen, like her son, King Charles, was a music buff. And her interests spanned genres from classical to bagpipes. Many mornings, she woke up to the sound of a piper. Musicians played almost everywhere the Queen went. But as for what it's like to play for royalty, well, Jeff Semple found out.
Claire Jones is practicing for a performance that's fit for a king. The Welsh musician first struck a chord with the royal family back in 2007, chosen to become Prince Charles's official harpist, a centuries-old position, discontinued after Queen Victoria, but resurrected by Charles.
King Charles has always been an advocate for the arts.
Over 4 years, she performed at 180 royal engagements, leading orchestras, playing solo for 75,000 in a rugby stadium, and serenading Will and Kate's royal wedding reception.
I relished every opportunity and loved every second.
But one of her most memorable moments was performing alone, just for the Queen.
She asked me about the role, wanted to know more about the harp, the royal harp I was playing at the time. It was such a surreal moment to do that because I think people prepare so much to play for royalty, and of course having a chance to do it with just her in the room was pretty incredible.
Music has long played an enormous role in royal ceremonies, and Monday's funeral will be no different. Some of the last musicians to ever perform for the Queen were actually Canadian.
In August, this Ottawa pipe and drum troupe was invited to perform at Balmoral Castle. The Queen is known for her love of bagpipes, and the Canadians also had corgis.
You want to do a really good job, so maybe you stand up a bit straighter and you're just doing your very, very best.
This pipe major performed for Her Majesty on 5 occasions. Last month, she says the Queen seemed in great spirits. She never imagined this performance would be the last.
I'm just delighted that she was so gracious to invite us, and give us that opportunity.
It's very difficult, I think, for us in Britain to imagine a future, really, without the Queen being there.
Jones left the palace in 2011, but after the Queen's death, she and her composer husband were asked to write a new song to welcome Charles to Wales for the first time as king.
Slightly on the somber side, because we have to remember he's only become king because of the passing of our Queen, but it's a rite of passage, isn't it? It's the inevitability of our tradition here in the UK.
Making music to match the moment, a soundtrack for history. Jeff Semple, Global News, Cardiff.
The Queen loved her music, and we all know she loved her tea too. Earl Grey, to be specific, piping hot with a splash of milk. Well, today, in her honor, some elementary students in Saskatoon got to enjoy their own version of high tea, complete with biscuits and vintage cups. That's Global National for this Friday. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night from London.